Hi, so today we're going to go over a little pre-lab lecture for the density and salinity experiment for Chem 100A. So, density of seawater, let's think about that for a second. What would we expect the density of DI water to be? It's roughly 1 milligram per liter, and that's going to just depend a little bit on temperature. And how would the density of seawater compare to that? Greater than, less than, equal to? It's going to be greater than that of DI water because there are a lot more ions and such dissolved in it. Okay, so density is important from an environmental standpoint. The density is going to affect the convection currents in the ocean. Denser liquids are going to sink and less dense liquids are going to rise, and that's going to cause convection in the ocean, and those currents can also affect the climate and the atmosphere. So important to be able to measure it. So in this experiment, you guys are learning 4 different methods for measuring the density. So 2 of those methods are direct. That means that you're directly measuring density. First one of those is a volumetric method. You're going to be using BOD bottles. The second method is to use a density meter. The other 2 methods are indirect because we're actually measuring the salinity. Okay, the first one of those is using a conductivity meter. And the second is a refractometer. And we can convert these indirect methods that are measuring salinity. We can go back and forth between calculating density. Okay, and the way we can go back and forth between those 2 is using what's called the Malero equation. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so this first method, BOD bottle. Okay, BOD stands for biological oxygen demand. Okay, that comes from the idea that we can measure dissolved oxygen in a liquid using these bottles, and you will actually be doing that later in this course. The big thing with these bottles is that they remove air from your sample. You fill up the bottle, overfill it, and then put a cap in it, and that's going to set this distinct volume that'll be consistent throughout your experiment. So when you remove all of the air using this bottle, you get consistent volume measurements. So this part of the experiment uses kind of a basic understanding of density. You may be familiar with the idea that density is equal to mass divided by volume. And say you filled your BOD bottle with deionized water, you could have this expression for DI specifically. And then maybe you fill another BOD bottle with seawater. And you would have a similar expression. Now, you'll remember I just said that if you're using a BOD bottle, it's going to have a consistent volume no matter what you fill it with, which means that these volume terms are equal to each other. So we can rearrange those formulas, solve for volume, set them equal to each other, and you're left with this. Mass of DI water divided by density of DI is equal to the mass of seawater divided by the density of seawater, and you are solving for density of seawater. And these terms the masses, you're measuring those. You're filling a BOD bottle and then you're putting it on a balance and weighing it. This density of DI water is known. You can get it from the CRC handbook based on the temperature that your water measured. Just a reminder, you guys need to do air propagation. And I'll walk you through that for this first part. So in this math that we just did, we're doing division to solve for that density of seawater. So the air associated with the density of seawater will need to be found using the division air propagation formula, which will look like this. You'll take the answer that you just got, density of seawater, and you'll multiply it by the square root of the sum of the squares of the relative uncertainties for each term. So what you need to do, look at your math. This is the math we're doing. Look at each term and determine, does that term have an uncertainty associated with it? So in the experiment, you went and you measured a bunch of BOD bottles filled with DI. You have an average mass, and there can be a standard deviation related to that mass. Okay, so that'll be one term. We'll take that standard deviation associated with the mass of DI and divide it by the average mass of DI. Okay, square it. Let's see, do we have any other terms? The density of DI water can be considered a constant, so that does not have an error associated. This mass of seawater, similar to before, that one does. So let's go standard deviation, the mass of seawater divided by the average mass of seawater, squared, bam. Okay, let's move on to our next method, which was density, using the density meter. Okay, density is a very direct method. It's the most direct method. Essentially just send your sample through and it spits out the density. You don't even need to do any calculations after the fact, which is very nice. Some things you do want to consider though is how well is it doing? So you're sending your sample through, in there is a U-tube capillary, a U-shaped capillary tube, and it's calculating the density based on the vibrations of that U-tube. The frequency that it vibrates is related to the density of the sample that's inside it. But you want to make sure that it works properly. So when you first start using the density meter, you measure DI first. But you should know, in theory, using literature, what the density of DI water at a given temperature should be. So you want to compare that literature value from the CRC handbook and compare it to what your instrument is spitting out and see, is there a percent difference? And maybe there is a difference, but is it within the tolerance? Of the instrument. So all instruments are going to report in their manual their tolerance. So you will want to look up the manual for the density meter used in this experiment. What is the tolerance, that plus or minus? See, did what you measure land within that tolerance? Are you good to go, or do you need to bring in some factor to your results? Next up is conductivity meter. So we're switching to indirect methods now. Conductivity meter is indirect because we're measuring salinity. Now, the idea behind this, conductivity is a measure of how well electricity can flow through a solution. So the higher the salinity, that means there's more ions, and ions are able to transport charge well, which means there's more electricity flowing, which means conductivity is higher. Okay, so the higher the salinity means there's more ions, which means there's a higher conductivity. And that's represented by this symbol. In practice, the conductivity meter is very similar to a pH probe. You want to follow similar practices with doing a calibration first, rinsing with DI water and dabbing between each step, etc. So with that, the first step is always to use a calibration solution. So you'll be measuring 3 different solutions in this. Like I said, that first one is a calibration solution. You'll just do that once and it'll be good to go for your next couple measurements, which the next one will be a reference solution. This reference has a known salinity. And next up is the seawater sample. Okay, so using this conductivity meter, you're going to get a conductivity measurement, and we're going to determine the salinity of our seawater sample by using proportions. So with that reference solution, we can measure its conductivity, and we know the salinity that's associated with that. And so we can just set up a nice little proportion where we compare that ratio for seawater as well. Okay, and again, you'll be solving for the salinity of seawater in that expression. Remember, air propagation. Next method that we're using is the refractometer. This is another indirect method. So again, we're measuring salinity. The concept behind this is different materials with a different refractive index can bend light. So if we have some light coming in here, if it hits a material of a different refractive index, it might bend it. Okay, liquid with a higher salinity has a higher refractive index. Okay. The relationship for this can be found in Canvas, and we have the equation that shows how salinity and refractive index are connected, and it goes like this. Okay, so you'll be measuring this, and you'll be solving for salinity. Now, I discussed how in some of these parts you measured density directly, in some of them you measured salinity, and we can go back and forth between the two so that we have a density result and a salinity result for every method we did in this experiment. And the way we interchange between those is with the Malero equation. Okay, so we can interchange between density and salinity. The spreadsheet for this is on Canvas. So Malero was just some scientist, some researcher who did a bunch of theory analysis, did a bunch of math, figured out the relationship between density and salinity, made a nice little spreadsheet calculator for it, and published that. And that's something common in research. I actually was just doing that in my lab this week, trying to optimize a part of an instrument, and read this paper that had an associated Excel spreadsheet where you just plug in certain quantities and it spits out other quantities in order to optimize an instrument. Very helpful. And so you guys are going to practice that right here. So that equation, this Malero equation that was determined, shows that density equals rho naught plus AS plus BS to the 3 halves plus CS. Okay, these constants here, A, B, and C, are temperature dependent. So you'll need to plug in the temperature that you measured. S stands for salinity. This rho naught is the density of DI at your given temperature, and rho is the density of your sample. So in the case of these last two methods, these indirect methods, the conductivity meter and the refractometer, you measure salinity and you want to calculate density. So you simply just plug in salinity and solve for density using the spreadsheet calculator. On the other hand, for the BOD bottle and the density meter, you measured the density and you want to calculate the salinity. But you may notice that might be kind of tricky. If you were to plug in a density and try to solve for salinity, it would be hard because we have 3 salinities in this expression and it's not linear. You can't just add them together because this is the 3 halves and so on and so forth. So what you do is use what's called an iterative method, where you just guess and check. You're trying to find salinity, so just plug in random salinity values until you get the one that's correct. Plug in salinity until you get the resulting density that you measured. Okay, the last part of this experiment of the analysis is an important component in analytical chemistry. You want to make sure that you're using the best instrument you can to do the measurements. So this is your chance to practice comparing methods. So you're going to want to look at different figures of merit. So figures of merit are just a quantitative value that represents how good, how meritable your instrument is. So one you might want to consider is accuracy. How accurate was your measurement from this instrument? And the quantitative term you want to use to represent that is percent error. Oops. Okay, percent error using some literature value. So in this experiment, you measure density and salinity of seawater. You might want to go look up literature values for density and salinity and compare that to what you actually got. Another one might be precision. How precise was your measurement? And the figure of merit to represent that is percent relative standard deviation, which the formula for that is you take the uncertainty and you divide it by the mean and you multiply by 100. Another figure of merit you might want to look at is the cost. And I'm just going to lump in time as well right here. So imagine you're a company and you exclusively measure the density of liquid samples, and you hire one person and you want to buy one instrument and have that person measure the density of the samples they're given all day, every day, and that's it. So you want to choose the method that's maybe the most cost effective and the quickest. You know, you're paying this human their wage and their health insurance, and you want to make sure that they're able to pump out as many results in a day as possible. So you want to consider how expensive that instrument was, but also how quick it was at determining densities. You might want to also think about the volume of the sample you're able to measure. You know, some methods require larger volumes of samples, but maybe that company is just getting really small samples, or vice versa. And so have fun thinking about those, and see you next time.